So hi, everyone. Happy to be here. I'm Kyle Morgenstern, co-founder and chief strategy officer for Vulcan Cyber. I've been working in the cybersecurity industry for the last 20 years, mostly as a practitioner, but also for a few years as managing compliance for PCI DSS. I'm a certified QSA. So I've been
sorry.
I've been on both sides of the aisle. So if you have ever gone through PCI assessment, then you know the pain. And with me is Andy Ellis, who doesn't need any introduction, but nevertheless, maybe Andy, a few words on yourself.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Longtime CISO. I ran Akamai Security for 20 years. I'm now an operating partner at Weil Ventures, and I do advisory CISO and consulting work with a lot of startup cybersecurity companies. And I wrote the definitive best book on leadership anybody will ever read. It's 1% Leadership, in case this font is too small on your screen.
Yeah, thank you. Happy to have you here. So maybe let's jump right in. So how do you see really the relationship between compliance and risk management, and how does how we can utilize risk management to improve our compliance needs, and the other way around maybe?
Yep. So I like to look at cybersecurity risk management as basically being three domains, which I think of as future, present, and past. And present is the easiest one. That's security operations. That's like what is going wrong right now and how do we fix it? It's a lot of process, like, oh, we found a problem, let's fix a problem, very transactional. Future is the domain of risk management, which is how do we predict what's going to happen in the future? How do we assess our security? How do we implement good controls to prevent ourselves from going off the cliff? Like, think of yourself as, you're whitewater rafting, and in certain paths you die, and in certain paths you don't die. Stay off the paths that you're gonna, die on, and stay on the good paths. And I think of compliance as the past, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but we have said in the past that something is true. Like, we took this path and said, we're not going to do a dangerous thing. Compliance is the art of making sure that remains true forever. And often what happens is people sort of get these two sort of confused. They say, well, to do compliance, I need to do this thing. No. Compliance is pointing out that you might have a risk, and now you need to do risk management to do this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, look, you've done PCI DSS, so you know that there are things in that standard that are not actually about risk management that you do just because, Visa said, oh, let's do this thing. And I think it's really important for, security practitioners to understand when you're doing a thing just to check the box versus when it is good risk management. Mm-hmm. And sometimes the way you're going to solve this problem is not actually the way the auditor wants you to solve it. I once had that with FedRAMP. Akamai was the first company to go through FedRAMP. And FedRAMP never envisioned a company that was in 2,000 data centers. So they had, like, the program office wanted me to have humidity sensors in my data centers. And I'm like, I don't care if the data centers are too humid. I have like 5 servers in most of these data centers. If one of them, like, the humidity is bad, there's a company going out of business that's not me. And I'm okay with it.
But so do you think really that, but we can utilize the fact that risk management is in the future? If we do good risk management practices, then it really helps with our compliance needs, because you don't need to. So, a lot of times you go, you have an assessment, doesn't matter if it's FedRAMP or PCI or SOC 2, and things are not exactly in order. So if you have good processes, good practices, that eventually really helps also with the compliance side.
Oh, absolutely. Because if you're doing risk management and security correctly, compliance is really just a typesetting job. Because you have good processes, you've documented your processes, they're well controlled, so you have evidence that your processes work. And now it's just a case of, like, how do you package this and publish it to an auditor to say, look, we've actually done really fantastic things here. We have a great exposure management program. And so when you came along and said, well, you have to have an SLA for patching things, you can be like, well, not only do we have an SLA, we actually measure it, we track deviations from it, we're doing all the right things because we want to reduce the risk. And whether you're using KEV or EPSS or some other system for prioritization, at the end of the day, if you are patching your systems, then you're patching your systems. And the compliance team just wants to know that that's happening and have the evidence. Whereas if you don't have any evidence, you're probably not actually doing it.
Oh, for sure. So in your view, how do you manage, like if you're in breach of a compliance, so let's say you're not meeting one of the or few of the requirements, how do you manage that risk? On a day-to-day basis?
Yeah. So there's basically three approaches. And I like the way you phrased it, even if it was unintentional. Not meeting a compliance standard is a risk in its own right that is not about what you're not doing. It's about the fact that an auditor might say bad things about you. Like your single biggest adversary as a CISO is actually all of your auditors, not the hackers trying to break in. Because one of them denying you affects your immediate customer base. So that's a risk to manage. And so you really have, I think, three different strategies. So one strategy is like they found a thing that is legitimate and you should fix it, and you should fix it right now. So you go fix it. One is they found a thing that's kind of legitimate, but it's not actually that important. And so you're going to have to work with whether it's your auditor or your customer, because remember, sometimes your customers are auditing you, to say, look, we're going to fix this, but it's not more important than these 8 other things we're working on. And we're just going to be transparent and let you know. The big challenge is when they find a thing that's actually not broken. And now you have to deal with the fact that, and maybe it's because you did something better. I recall we had many years when we were going through the ISO 27002 assessments that we had to work with our auditors because for our deployed network, they had all these controls about password rotation. And we had moved off of password rotation passwords in 2000. Everything was key-based authentication, 15 years ahead of that being the norm in the industry. But they kept giving us findings because we weren't rotating keys at the rate you should rotate a password. And I'm like, this is silly. I refuse to do it. And so we had to do so many compensating controls. And so recognize that if you're going to do something better than what the standard is requiring, so you're not doing what the standard is requiring, you are signing up for a lot of documentation.
Oh yeah, for sure. That reminds me a story from the old PCI days. That PCI in one of the first iterations used to mention rating vulnerabilities with the CVSS score specifically, and you had to fix anything above a 7. Above a 7 in 30 days or something like that. And then we had companies doing risk-based vulnerability management, which was very novel 10 years ago, but still some companies were doing that, and it just didn't meet the standards. But it's actually a better approach than what the standard is suggesting. And then, of course, 2 iterations later, they also now revised it, and now it's completely risk-based. So
yeah, we were one of the companies in that boat, is that we basically said, look, we have high, medium, and low, and CVSS is an input to a human evaluation. So if it's above a 7, it's presumed to be a high until a human evaluates it, but the human can then say, no, this one in that environment is really a low. But it was a lot of extra paperwork to do what was really a better thing than what the industry sort of had. And it was entertaining, as we were actually the first company to use CVSS. We were part of the initial test pilot at Akamai.
That's funny.
Yeah.
So maybe we kind of touched on scoring. So maybe let's zoom out a little bit and talk about how to measure risk in an effective way. Not necessarily regarding compliance, but how do you see that tying back to to manage processes and risk management overall?
So entertainingly, I just did a talk at RSA that was titled "You Can't Measure Risk." And I think this is one of the big challenges that the security industry now has, is how do you communicate about risk when you're really talking about something immeasurable? The challenge is when we talk about risks, first of all, nobody agrees on what a risk is. Is it a hazard? Is it a scenario? Is it the aggregate for an environment? So we have to settle on what we're talking about. But when I think about hazards themselves, we have a problem, whether it's a vulnerability or an architectural defect. If you think about the old risk 9 box, you have these, the 4 interesting corners are the high and low corners, not the mediums. And so if something is high damage, high likelihood, you deal with that like an incident. Nobody scores these. You literally just glance over at it. You're like, oh my goodness, this is awful. You don't have to measure it. You don't have to say, oh, this is a $70 million risk. Everybody gets it. Why? Because it's an easy story to tell. And so we have a process for those. We call it incident management. You don't do anything in that. In the sort of the low damage area, we have two different things. The low damage but high frequency, I like to think of that as hygiene, right? Those are the EPSS or KEVs, right? These are highly likely to bite you, but in small ways. And so you need to just do hygiene. It's like brushing your teeth every night. You just brush your teeth every night. The fact that we try to focus so much energy on measuring each and every one of those is because we haven't gotten to the point that cleaning them up is easy. And so we're really trying to push onto our security tools and our security teams this effort to do prioritization that is greater than the cost of actually just fixing the problems.
Yeah.
Now, in the low corner is where you have what I think of as litter. Like you walk out on the street, there's trash in the street. You don't want to have to measure every single piece of litter to say, we need a street sweeper to come through on some regular basis and deal with all the trash, right? All of the vulnerabilities that don't matter, all of the support patches that you're like, yes, we should just take these so we don't get really far out of date. Now, the interesting corner where people often get stuck is that, low probability but high damage. I like to think of this as the special projects. Like you didn't actually implement TLS correctly on your entire infrastructure, and now you have to rebuild everything. This is a lot of work to do. If it bites you, it's going to hurt a lot. But it's not really likely to bite you in some easy way, right? So here's like sort of my 9-box for this, right? Incidents, hygiene programs in that bottom corner is what I'd call litter, like the stuff you just kind of ignore. And the challenges with programs is they're very expensive to do, right? Fix these high damage, low likelihood things, very expensive. And so they require a lot of justification. So we put heavyweight risk management and risk prioritization here. And then we try to apply that same heavyweight work over to the stuff on the other side, to hygiene. You should not be spending days justifying patching a system. It should literally be, we say, oh, this has to be patched either right now, real soon, or at the next available update. And anytime you say, well, prove to me that I need to patch it, you're now wasting energy. And that's usually a sign that you have some dysfunction in engineering that makes it expensive to get changes out. Maybe go fix that.
Yeah, but maybe that's a good thing about compliance. It gives you kind of an excuse for the spending. Like if you're not meeting the regulation or not meeting the compliance, you can say, hey, we have to do this because otherwise we will be,
Right. We need to, but I think that the biggest place we've failed as an industry is that we think it is our job, us being the cybersecurity professionals, to make sure that systems get patched. Mm-hmm. And it's not. We don't own systems. Imagine if you had a race car. You're an F1 racer, if anybody loves F1, and you've got a race car, and it's got an entire team of people who are dedicated to upgrading that car on a regular basis all throughout the season as we get improvements. And they do all the maintenance on the car. And then you came along and said, oh, by the way, there's a defect in the fuel injection pump. I have to go fix it, and I have to make sure it gets fixed. No, you'd be like, the same people who are upgrading the fuel injection pump are required to deal with it when it's got a bug.
Yeah.
And so
it's a collaborative.
Collaborative. Yeah. And so what we need to do as security professionals is get better about measuring the efficacy of our processes rather than measuring each individual risk item. If there's 1 million vulnerabilities in your system, you should not have 1 million different scores. You should have one. How well does the engineering team actually patch these systems?
Yeah, that makes sense. Maybe it's a good segue to really talk about the new EU regulations that Gal mentioned at the beginning of the talk. It's kind of interesting because I think they're taking a more modern approach. So the EU has recently announced two regulations. One is NIS2, not to be confused with NIST.
Not to be confusing, but we're going to use the same name.
Yeah, exactly. So it's actually fixing the existing NIS Act and also DORA. So they are both regulations coming from the EU body. Mm-hmm. They both focus on resiliency, which is key. Basically, it's the required outcome instead of the specifics of what you need to do. Where DORA is more focused on the financial markets, and this is more broader for the critical infrastructure. So that's also also energy and banks and so on, and healthcare, of course,
and telecom providers.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. And they really give a nice framework for what is expected from these organizations in terms of risk management and resiliency.
Yeah, and if you were already doing it, these are probably not really big lifts for you. And if you're in those regulated spaces, hopefully you were already doing this. One of the things that I actually like about these is how narrowly focused they are. You know, I've had a bunch of people like, oh my God, NIS2 showed up. And I'm like, are you critical infrastructure in the EU? And they're like, well, I don't know. And the answer then is you're not. Because if you're critical infrastructure, you know it because there's so much oversight already on you for being in those spaces. And the worst thing you can do, by the way, if you are like an internet service provider that's not already covered, is get the EU to be convinced you're critical infrastructure, because it just adds more work for you. I wouldn't recommend it at all. And so that's NIS2. DORA, every time I say DORA, I want to say Dora the Explorer. You can tell when my kids were little. DORA's a little bit more wide-ranging around the financial markets. But again, like these are not really big changes. And I think that's really important for everybody to get. If you have structured your security program well, that you understand what risks you're dealing with, all of these compliance frameworks, it's just like publishing a book in a new language. Right? You probably already have almost all these controls. Now you just have somebody else to satisfy by packaging them in a new way, delivering them on whatever basis they're going to want to see them to demonstrate that you're doing this.
Yeah, definitely. I see we have a question from the audience regarding NIS2.
Yep.
So maybe let's tackle that. So we're UK based. We have customers operating in the EU zone. They fall under the important and essential. Do we need to wait until the specific countries publish their laws that meet NIS2 requirements before taking action? So maybe one step back. The specifications for NIS2 have been published, but they're actually, I think, taking effect, if I remember correctly, the end of January. So there are a few months left until this is actual mandatory.
And I think you have October is for NIS2. DORA is in January.
Oh, okay, okay. Sorry.
But what that means is that in October of this year, the EU member states are required to publish their new measures, right? This is one of the things that if you're just a spectator to the EU and you're far away, you don't really grasp. But the European Parliament doesn't actually pass laws that directly affect the EU. They pass laws that then EU governments are required to follow and pass their own versions of the laws. At least that's the one sentence description of a very convoluted process. So you technically don't have to do anything about NIS2 yet. But because NIS2 tells you what the standard is that every entity is going to have to comply with, you can basically get out ahead of this. Build your draft, like here's our NIS2 compliance package, so we can explain to you how we satisfy NIS2, assuming it's relevant to you, your customers. You say, we're going to update this as it comes out. The important thing to remember for any company is compliance is a product marketing feature, first and foremost. Like, yes, you need to do it, but you need compliance because you're in a market. And so if you think of it as a product marketing feature, now you're like, oh, this regulation is going to come out. I want to market that I'm satisfying the regulation even before it exists. And that once it happens, I will market again that I am doing it. Look at like Okta has like the first hit. If you type in NIS2 DORA, Okta is one of the first people who published something as a write-up. You should be thinking this as a market advantage if you're already mostly compliant or you expect to be compliant with what's going to come out.
That makes a lot of sense. So Andy, our time is up, unfortunately. We can probably speak compliance for hours.
Oh, yes.
So thank you very much for your time and great insights as always. And
thanks for having me.